For part 2 of this addendum to the documentary film Disrupted Land, I spoke with economist Russel Lamberti, whom we have also interviewed for the film. Lamberti expressed some noteworthy criticisms of the film and has made interesting observations about how different communities evaluate history in different ways. We also spoke about the lessons to be learned from history when dealing with contentious issues such as expropriation without compensation. Russel, thank you very much. So you appeared in the film and you made some great comments about especially the economic side of land reform. And also afterwards you had some constructive criticism about aspects that you feel could have been added to the film. Maybe we should start there and you can explain what your thoughts were in that regard.
Ernst, I think overall the documentary does a pretty good job of laying out some of the key issues, but I think if I had an overarching criticism, it's possibly that the film was a little bit lopsided in terms of focus on older history and seemed to rush through the latter part of South Africa's history very, very quickly. And I think there needed to be more balance in terms of that. Also because a lot of the land angst in this country, I think stems very much from the apartheid era, forced removals, and the Group Areas Act. I'm not saying that's the only source of land grievance, but it's certainly the most contemporary. And I also think it's the easiest to redress. I think it's the easiest to restitute Group Areas Act injustices. It's very, very contemporary history, and it was certainly easier in 1994 to do so. And we're now 25 years later, and so it's becoming harder and harder as we move through time. And so I think the documentary may have missed an opportunity there to really get into some of the depth of what the apartheid system was and how it deprived people of not only land but basic human rights. And of course, you know, as a result, we know that the sort of Verwoerd section has been extremely controversial. And my criticism was that, you know, there was a lot of error by omission. You know, some of the things that were said about Verwoerd were undoubtedly true, but it's easy to say true things about people without revealing the sort of full extent of perhaps who they were and what they stood for. And I think more could have been made of not necessarily who Verwoerd was, but the consequences of Verwoerd's ideas. Those ideas had significant consequences and have, you know, been a huge mark on this country over the last 50 or 60 years, and something that, you know, we continue to live with some of that legacy, and certainly all the political change of the 90s was very much around that apartheid era system. So I think a lot more could have been made of that and how that feeds into the land question. And so that was probably a missed opportunity in that sense. But of course, that history can be made clear in the future in other ways. And I think if you'd focused more on that and more on the consequences of the ideas of Verwoerd, and how sometimes you get a mismatch between ideas and consequences of ideas, I think that would have been a really interesting sort of theme to explore.
Yeah, this links a bit to a discussion that we had before the interview about the comments that were made recently by Jacob Rees-Mogg in England, the British politician, when he spoke about the concentration camps during the Anglo-Boer War. And we had a bit of a debate about the issue, and I think at least a conclusion you could make from that discussion is that we approached the issue from different perspectives, in the sense that for me, as an Afrikaner and as someone whose grandfather was almost in one of those camps, it was more important to stress how wrong it was and how we should never repeat those mistakes. And for you, speaking from another perspective, it seems as if you were putting more effort into trying to understand what happened and why it happened. And why do you think this phenomenon is there?
Yeah, I think different people, different groups of people, different cultural communities are far more emotionally invested in certain aspects of history than others. And that creates an asymmetry in the historical debates that we have. And it's a very, very difficult asymmetry to resolve. It can lead to a lot of anger, and a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of frustration. I think if you look at the Boer War, for example, there's no cultural community that's more emotionally invested in the Boer War than the Afrikaner community. And if you're not in that community, it's perhaps easier, or you just have the luxury of perhaps being able to look at it in a slightly more arm's length, perhaps more objective way. But it doesn't mean you're going to look at it more accurately necessarily. But you come from just a very different perspective where you don't have that emotional attachment to it. And it was fascinating just having some debates around the Rees-Mogg comments, because it just dawned on me so clearly how history is a very cultural thing. It's a very subjective thing in many, many ways. Now, there is, to some degree, of course, there's objective historical truth, or at least that there's a range of objective truth about history. Yeah. But within that range, there's tremendously divergent perspectives. One of the things that dawns on me is that we can't even agree amongst ourselves how to analyze the present day. What is the zeitgeist? What is the nature of present day politics or contemporary history? We have wide disagreements on whether South Africa is a socialist country or a kleptocracy or a crony capitalist system. We don't have agreement on this stuff, and yet we somehow think that when we look back 50 years, there needs to be singular, clear narratives of what that history was. And I actually think the reverse is true. I think as we move through time, it becomes harder and harder to find the truth about history, and it makes history worth studying in depth and worth understanding some of these tremendous complexities about history. And I think if you translate Boer War disagreements to apartheid disagreements, you can see again that there were certain cultural communities that were far more invested or have far more emotional investment in what the apartheid system was, particularly black communities in South Africa. And as an Afrikaans community, there's actually also an emotional connection to apartheid. But I think the emotion there is trying to understand how a group of people who are very much a part of your cultural community can act on bad ideas and sort of perpetrate them into a system that becomes extremely oppressive over other groups of people. And so the emotion there is one of trying to understand that, trying to be maybe a little bit defensive about that, and trying to figure out how best to learn lessons from that episode, not repeat the process, but equally not condemn to, I guess, ultimate evil the people that were involved in that system. Jordan Peterson has made the point in the past that ordinary people were part of perpetrating some of the worst atrocities of Nazi Germany or communist Russia. And far more interesting than just condemning these people and what they did, I think, is understanding the psychology and the social psychology of how they got from being ordinary, peaceful people who just wanted to have jobs and send their kids to school and have a nice life, to perpetrating some of these awful deeds. And I think that when we gloss over history and we turn it into a meme of good versus evil and very simplistic historical mono-narratives, we really miss the opportunity to understand and to learn some critical lessons about good and bad ideas, about how people get swept along in them, and about how people in service to state ideology can end up doing things that they would never have imagined themselves doing. That to me is a far more fruitful discussion around how to interpret and understand history. And combining that with understanding that different cultural communities are always going to see history in either slightly or sometimes very different ways, and we need to figure out how to accommodate those differences in our society.
Herman Gilumea made the point that in the film we point out that there were forced dispositions and it was an injustice and so forth, but also that there were certain criteria that were set that had to be adhered to for those dispositions to take place. And in my discussion with him, he pointed out that yes, that's true, but that's not necessarily how it transpired in practice. And it made me think about the current discussion about expropriation without compensation. And so there's a bill on the table currently that says there's a list of criteria that have to be adhered to. Do you think there's a link there, or how do you think the discussion about history and dispositions during apartheid is relevant to the discussion about expropriation without compensation?
Look, that's a great question. I think, a huge lesson from apartheid, not necessarily the lesson from apartheid, but certainly a big lesson from apartheid and that era, is that when you centralize big decisions about the economy and about society in the hands of a centralized state, so much can go wrong. Not only does it go wrong because of complexity, but it can often go wrong because of institutional corruption, if you like. Very often the state is only accountable to itself, and so it doesn't very often go through with its promises. Sometimes the state says we will follow a certain due process, and perhaps they expect us to believe that the courts will force them to uphold that process. And that's probably what happened under the Group Areas Act and the forced removals. But we forget that the courts are essentially an organ of the state. And many of the judges are part of the elite that are in power. And we saw that with the National Party and government, and we are certainly seeing that with the ANC and government. And so if we're talking about learning lessons from history, let's learn this lesson, that when the government promises you that they will follow a particular process, don't believe them. Don't believe them. Hold them, radically accountable at every step, and don't take their word. The government should be distrusted until proven otherwise, rather than trusted until proven otherwise. When the ANC says that it will only, expropriate certain kinds of land, but it creates for itself an effective constitutional mandate to expropriate any property of any sort, and that seems to be what the ANC is trying to achieve. You don't trust them. You don't trust that. You then trust that if this power falls into an even worse government, what can they do with it? So I think that the inability of the apartheid government to honor some of its supposed pledges to relocate people in a humane and kind of legally sound way. I mean, I think even that is a stretch, because I think already you're moving people forcefully, which is an inherent injustice, I think. But even if you take the latter issue, it's not surprising that they didn't stand by that, because it would have been a huge effort for them to stick by that, and they didn't need to by the standards of the day. And I think there's a strong parallel to land reform and land expropriation risk in South Africa, and the idea that you would trust this present government, and certainly any kind of state, to follow the or to adhere to its promises around how they will carry out this process is just a non-starter. We have to be distrustful and I think highly vigilant citizens and civil rights activists, if you like, as to what the ANC is planning around land reform.
Russel, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ernst.
What stuck to me after these conversations was that we need to be speaking more about history rather than less. We need to be factual and balanced, but also we should particularly not shy away from pointing out historical facts that do not align with the mainstream narrative. In doing so, we need to be cautious in the way in which we present our case, or in which we respond to distortions about the past, which is often quite difficult, especially during fast-paced live media interviews. We need to acknowledge atrocities, of which there were many, and we need to point out when history is fabricated
in order to support political or ideological ideas. We ought to be careful on how we deal with past atrocities in which we were not the victims, so as not to come across as unsympathetic to the pain of others. On the other hand, we ought to be careful on how we deal with past atrocities in which our own communities were the victims, so as not to be so emotional that we succumb to historical revisionism in order to silence our opponents or to elevate our victimhood. This is easy to say, but hard to do in practice. In my off-camera conversations with Lamberti, he also commented that we need to be able to distinguish between noble and evil ideas, but that we ought to be more cautious about atrocious things that could transpire in the execution of ideas that might be described as noble.